For 10 years, the greatest army the ancient world had ever assembled sat outside one city and could not get in. They had kings and heroes. They had the finest warriors of an age. They burned the countryside. They won battles on the open plain. And still the walls of Troy stood, exactly where they had always stood. And behind them the city lived on. And then one morning, the Trojans woke up, looked out from those walls, and saw something that made them believe, at last, that it was over. The enemy camp was a field of cold ashes. The ships were gone from the shore, the plain was empty, the Greeks had given up and sailed home, and standing alone on the beach, where the camp had been, was a horse, an enormous horse, built of wood, taller than the gate, silent and strange in the morning light. The Trojans had won. So they walked out of the safety of their walls to look at the thing the enemy had left behind. And by nightfall, they had torn a hole in their own defenses, with their own hands, dragged that horse inside the city, and thrown the party that ended their world. The walls of Troy did not fall to an army. They did not fall to a siege engine, or a hero, or a god. They fell to a gift, and the deadliest weapon in the history of war carried no blade at all. It carried an idea, and the Trojans carried it through the gate themselves. This is the story of the Trojan horse. And it is not really the story of a horse. It is the story of the first time in recorded memory that someone looked at an unbreakable wall and understood that the wall was never the target. The target was the mind behind it. Because when force fails for 10 years, you stop attacking the stone and you start attacking the judgment of the people standing on it. Start with the war, because you have to understand how badly force had already failed. The Greeks came to Troy to take back a stolen queen, and they came in overwhelming strength. The tradition remembers 1,000 ships and the greatest names of the heroic age, and for 10 years, none of it was enough. Troy was a fortress, walls of dressed stone, high and thick, sitting on a height above the plain near the mouth of the straits. You could beat the Trojans in the field, and it changed nothing, because every evening they withdrew behind those walls, and the walls did not care how many battles you had won. The Iliad, the great poem of this war, does not even end with the city falling. It ends with the fighting still grinding on, both sides exhausted, the walls still standing. 10 years of the finest army in the world, and the problem was exactly the same as it had been on the first day, and the walls themselves carried a kind of dread. In the old stories, the great walls of Troy were not built by men at all. They were built by gods, by Poseidon and Apollo in an age before the war, and a thing raised by gods is not a thing you expect to knock down with ladders and rams. This is the reputation the Greeks were up against. Not just high stone, but the belief, on both sides, that Troy was meant to stand. Hold that detail because it comes back at the end in a way you will not expect. The god who was said to have built those walls was also the god who, in one version of the truth, may have finally brought them down. Remember that, and keep going. That is the situation that produces the horse. Not strength, the failure of strength. When the strongest army of the age cannot break a wall in 10 years, brute force is not the solution. It is the losing strategy. And one man among the Greeks understood that the way to take the city was to stop trying to take the city, and to make the city take itself. That man was Odysseus, not the strongest of the Greeks, the cleverest, and his plan was not a weapon. It was a lie, built out of wood. Here is the plan, the legend, hands down. The Greeks would build an enormous hollow horse, big enough to hide a group of their best warriors inside. The craftsman Epius built it, the story says, with the help of the goddess Athena. Then the rest of the army would do the one thing that would break the Trojans' resolve completely. They would leave. They would burn their camp, launch the ships, and sail out of sight behind the nearby island of Tenedos, just over the horizon. To anyone watching from the walls of Troy, the 10-year siege would simply be over. The enemy would be gone, and they would leave two things behind on the empty beach: the horse and one man. The man was named Sinon, and Sinon is the real weapon in this story. Everything else is theater. Sinon lets himself be found and captured by the Trojans, and he tells them a story. He tells them the Greeks have given up and gone home, and that before they left they built this horse as an offering to the goddess Athena, to beg for safe passage across the sea. And then he tells them the detail that is engineered to destroy them. The horse, he says, was deliberately built too large to fit through the gates of Troy. Because the Greeks were afraid. They knew that if the Trojans ever brought this sacred offering inside their city, Athena's favor would pass to Troy, and the city would become impregnable, untakeable, forever. Think about what that lie actually is. It does not ask the Trojans to lower their guard. It asks them to win. It takes the thing they want most in the world, the thing 10 years of war has denied them, absolute security, and it tells them it is sitting on the beach, and all they have to do to claim it is bring it inside. The weapon is not the horse. The weapon is the story wrapped around it. Sinon is a single-planted liar, and his words will do what 1,000 ships could not. And here is the darkest part of the design. Not everyone in Troy believed it. A priest named Laocoon saw it for what it was. He warned his people not to trust it. He is given, by the Roman poet Virgil, the line that has outlived everything else in the story. A line that has become a proverb in every European language. Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes. I fear the Greeks even when they bring gifts. Beware of gifts. He hurled a spear into the flank of the horse, and the legend says you could hear, faintly, the clatter of arms from inside. The warning was right there. The truth was one spear throw away. And then the sea opened. 2 enormous serpents rose out of the water, according to the story, and coiled around Laocoon and his 2 sons and crushed them to death in front of the entire city. To us, reading it now, it looks like the gods silencing the one man who saw the trap. To the Trojans, standing there watching their priest die the instant after he struck the offering, it looked like proof. Proof that he had been wrong. Proof that the horse was holy and that Laocoon had been punished for doubting it. The one true warning was not just ignored. It was turned in front of their eyes into the final argument for their own destruction. There was another warning, too. Cassandra, the Trojan princess cursed to see the future clearly and never to be believed, told them the horse would be the death of the city. She was, of course, not believed. That was her curse, and it was also, by now, the condition of the whole city. Troy had been handed the truth twice, by a priest and a prophet, and both times it chose the lie, because the lie was the thing it wanted to hear. So, they brought it in. And this is the image to hold on to, because it is the whole meaning of the story in a single act. The horse was too big for the gate, exactly as Sinon said, so the Trojans tore down part of their own wall to fit it through. The wall, the one thing that had kept them alive for 10 years. The one thing the entire Greek army had failed to breach, and the Trojans breached it themselves cheerfully, with their own hands, to make room for a trophy. There is no siege engine in history that ever did what the Trojans did to their own defenses that afternoon. Then they feasted. They celebrated the end of a 10-year war deep into the night. And they drank. And eventually the exhausted, triumphant, defenseless city fell asleep. And in the dark, Sinon lit a signal. The men climbed down out of the horse, Odysseus among them, and they opened the gates from the inside. Out on the black water, the fleet that had never really gone home slipped back to the beach, and the whole Greek army poured through the open gates of a sleeping city. What 10 years of war could not do was done in a single night. Troy was sacked and burned, and it fell in the end not because its wall was weak, but because its judgment was. And here is a detail that most people never notice, hidden in plain sight. The famous version of the horse, the one we have been following, is told inside the Odyssey, And the Odyssey is not a poem about the war. It is a poem about the man who thought of the horse, Odysseus, trying and failing for 10 more years to get home. 10 years to take the city by a trick, and then 10 more years lost at sea for the men who did it. The winners of Troy did not ride home to glory. They were scattered and drowned and cursed. One great king came home from Troy, only to be murdered in his own bath on the first night back. Odysseus wandered the edge of the world for a decade before he saw his own door again. The story that gives us the Trojan horse is underneath a long meditation on what deception costs the deceiver. The men who taught the world how to win by lying spent the rest of their lives paying for it. That is the truth sitting behind the Odyssey, and it is darker than the trick itself. Now stop the story here because you already understand the weapon, even if you have never thought about it this way. The genius of the Trojan horse was never the carpentry. It was the targeting. For 10 years, the Greeks had aimed at the wall. The horse aimed at something else entirely. It aimed at 3 things inside the Trojans that no wall could protect: their piety, their exhaustion, and their pride. You do not desecrate an offering to a goddess, so their faith held the trap. They were 10 years tired and desperate for it to be over, so their exhaustion sold them the lie. And it was a monument to their own victory, so their pride carried it home. Every single thing that made Troy strong, its devotion, its endurance, its confidence, was turned into a lever to open it. That is what a real deception does. It does not fight your strengths, it uses them. And notice who actually breaks the city. The Greeks do not breach the wall. The Trojans do. The Greeks do not drag the soldiers inside. The Trojans do. Every physical act that leads to the fall of Troy is performed willingly by the Trojans themselves. This is the thing that makes the Trojan horse the perfect weapon, and the reason it has never stopped being relevant. Its entire function is to make the target carry its own destruction through the gate, and to feel, while doing it, like it is winning. There is no defense against a wall you tear down yourself, and the real payload, the actual weapon, was not the wood, and it was not the men inside. It was sign-on. It was information. A single false story, well told, at the right moment, aimed at people who desperately wanted to believe it. The horse is just the box the lie came in. Which brings us to the harder question, the one underneath the legend. Did any of this actually happen? Was there ever really a wooden horse? And here the honest answer splits in two, because the war and the horse are not the same claim. Start with the city, because the city is real. For most of history, people assumed Troy was pure myth, a setting for poems no more real than the gods in them. Then, in the 1870s, a wealthy, ruthless treasure-hunting amateur named Heinrich Schliemann started digging into a mound called Hisarlik in what is now northwestern Turkey, and he found a city. He was in such a hurry to reach the fabled Troy of Homer that he drove a great trench straight down through the mound, and in doing so, he tore through and destroyed parts of the very city he was looking for, because the Troy of the Trojan War was not at the bottom. The mound was not one city. It was the stacked ruins of many, built and destroyed and rebuilt on the same spot across thousands of years. One layer of history pressed on top of the last. Schliemann found a hoard of gold and called it the treasure of Priam, king of Troy, and he was wrong about the date by 1,000 years. But he was right about the thing that mattered. There was a real city here. Later, careful archaeologists, above all Manfred Korfmann, spent decades excavating the site properly, with the patience Schliemann never had, and they found that Troy was bigger and more important than even the poem suggested. A walled citadel, with a large lower town spread out below it. A genuine power guarding one of the most strategic waterways in the ancient world. The straits where the Aegean meets the road to the Black Sea. Whoever held Troy held that gate. It was worth a war. Today most scholars accept it. Hisarlik is Troy. It is a real Bronze Age fortress, in the right place, of the right scale, guarding the right straits. And one of those layers tells a story that should make the hair stand up on your neck. The layer archaeologists call Troy 7A was destroyed, around 1180 before Christ, by fire, and it was not an accident. In the ruins they found bronze arrowheads embedded in the walls. They found human skeletons lying unburied in the streets, bodies left where they fell. They found a layer of ash and destruction as much as a meter thick. This is not a city that was abandoned. This is a city that was stormed, killed, and burned right around the traditional date of the Trojan War. The war, or a war at this exact place, is not fantasy. The ground remembers it. But now, look for the horse, because this is where the two halves of the answer come apart. There is no horse in the ground. There is, of course, no reason there would be. Wood rots. But there is something more telling than that. Look at where the horse appears in the written record, and how. The oldest surviving account, Homer's Odyssey, mentions it only briefly, in passing, as a story sung at a feast. The Iliad, the great epic of the war itself, does not contain the horse at all. The version everyone actually knows, the version with Sinon and Laocoon and the serpents and beware of gifts, is told at length by the Roman poet Virgil in the Aeneid, written around 700 years after Homer, and told deliberately from the Trojan side. The most famous details of the most famous stratagems in history come to us from a poem composed the better part of a millennium after the events it describes, and the sources cannot even agree on the basic facts. How many men were hidden in the horse? One ancient writer says 23, another names about 30, another says 50. Later, tradition settles on 40, and one source gives the frankly impossible figure of 3,000, which no wooden horse could hold and no defender could fail to notice being wheeled up to the gate. When your sources range from 24 to 3,000 for the single most important number in the story, you are not reading a military report. You are reading a legend, growing and changing in the retelling for centuries. So most historians do not believe there was a literal wooden horse packed with commandos. What they suspect instead is that the horse is a memory of something real, distorted into a symbol, and there are a few serious ideas about what that something was. The first is a siege engine. In the Bronze Age and after, armies did break walls with machines, battering rams and siege towers rolled up against the stone. And those machines were routinely covered in wet horse hides to keep defenders from setting them on fire, and they were sometimes even named and decorated after animals. A great wooden thing, sheathed in horse skin, that finally broke the wall of Troy, could very easily become, in the mouths of poets generations later, a great wooden horse. The second idea is stranger and in some ways more haunting. The horse may have been an earthquake. The Greek god Poseidon was god of the sea, but he was also, and this is the key, the god of horses and the god of earthquakes. His title was Enosikthon, the Earthshaker, and he was said to have helped destroy Troy. Troy sits in a region prone to earthquakes, and some of its walls show damage consistent with one. A quake that cracked open the famous walls, letting the attackers finally pour in, could have been remembered as a gift from Poseidon, the horse god, the Earthshaker. A horse from the sea that threw down the walls of Troy. Not a machine at all. A tremor mythologized into a monument. There is a third, quieter possibility. In Greek, the word for horse could also name a kind of ship, and it is possible that a garbled memory of Greek ships, slipping back to the shore by some trick to take the city, hardened over centuries into the image of a single wooden horse full of men. And the fourth possibility is the simplest, that there was never any object at all, and the horse was always a symbol. The Trojans in the old poems were called tamers of horses. A wooden horse breaking into Troy may have been from the very beginning a poet's image for the taming of Troy itself, the breaking of the horse people dressed as a story. We will probably never know which of these, if any, is the truth. But notice what has happened here, because this is the real point. It does not actually matter. Whether the horse was a siege engine, or an earthquake, or a fleet of ships, or a pure invention of a blind poet. The story of the Trojan horse became more powerful and more permanent than any real weapon of the Bronze Age. The bronze swords rusted. The walls fell into a mound that people forgot was even a city. But the idea survived. The idea of the hostile thing, disguised as a welcome gift. The danger you invite through your own gate because it wears the face of something you want. That is why, of every weapon and every stratagem in all of ancient history, this is the one that became a common word. We do not talk about the Trojan spear or the Trojan wall. We talk about a Trojan horse, and everyone in every language instantly knows what it means. The spy who is welcomed as a friend, the ally who is really an enemy. The file you download yourself that opens your machine from the inside to something waiting in the dark. That last one is not a metaphor anymore. It is a technical term. When the builders of the modern world needed a name for a program that hides a hostile purpose inside something the user willingly installs, they did not invent a new word. They reached back 3,000 years and called it a Trojan, a piece of code that gets you to open your own gate. The oldest trick in the story of war, running now in the machines in your pocket, under the exact same name, because the shape of the attack has not changed at all. Only the walls have. 3,000 years later, the single most effective form of attack ever conceived still carries the name of that morning on the beach at Troy, because nobody has ever improved on it. So go back at the end to the Trojans on their wall, watching the smoke rise from the empty enemy camp, feeling the 10-year weight finally lift off their shoulders. They were not stupid. They were not weak. Their wall had held against the greatest army in the world for a decade, and it never failed them. What failed was something the wall could not protect. They were tired, and they were proud, and they were offered exactly what they wanted, at exactly the moment they most wanted to believe it. And so they opened themselves up and pulled the danger inside and called it victory. The wall of Troy never fell. The judgment of Troy fell, and every deception since, from the spy in the court to the code in the machine, has been a version of the same ancient trick, aimed at the same soft target behind every wall ever built. So the next time the long danger seems to have finally passed, and someone leaves you a gift right there on the empty beach, the thing you have wanted for 10 years, sitting quietly, asking only to be brought inside, remember what really took Troy. It was not an army. It was not a horse. It was a story told to people who wanted to believe it, and they carried it in themselves.